Thank you, everyone. After this next panel, we'll take a short 5-minute break. And now I'd like to introduce our very own Kaiser, who is, of course, one of the co-hosts of SupChina's premium podcast, Sinica. We're honored to have him here today. Welcome, Kaiser.
Hey folks, thank you for sticking around. It's been a wonderful conference so far. I am extremely thrilled today to be making an announcement. We have partnered with GGV, which is a Sandhill Road, a very good Sandhill Road VC, which is an active investor in China, to produce a new podcast series which we launch today. The podcast is called the GGV 996 Podcast. I want you all to take your phones out right now, open up your podcast app and subscribe to it. Just go to iTunes or whatever it is that you use and search for GGV 996 and subscribe to that podcast. You will be grateful that you did because we are rolling out with an amazing first batch that are all online today. The first 4 include our very first one is with Jerry Yang, the legendary co-founder and former CEO of Yahoo, who was the engineer, of course, of the best business deal ever made with a Chinese company, which was Yahoo's investment, of course, in Alibaba, which was netted them just a ton of money and is probably the most important thing in Alibaba's in Yahoo's portfolio today. We also have the eminence grise of the Chinese tech world, Kai-Fu Lee, Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, and Andrew Ng, the AI maven, and Liu Zhen, who is the former chief strategy officer for Uber China, basically the head of Uber China, and has since gone on to be senior vice president at ByteDance, the really innovative company behind Toutiao, which is an AI-powered news app that's just wildly popular and for good reason in China. So you will be treated to all sorts of marvelous insights about the world of technology with this podcast. I want to first bring up a video of our friend Hans Tong. So Hans and Zara Zhang. Hans Tong is a kind of legendary VC in the cross-border investment world. And Zara Zhang is a former journalist and now an investment analyst at GGV, and they are the hosts of the show, which we are co-producing. So download it, check it out, give us your feedback. We're really excited to hear from you. And here is Hans.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hans Tong. I'm a managing partner at GGV Capital. I've been working on startups and investing in them in the US and China for the past 20 years. I'm excited to announce that GGV Capital is launching our new podcast called 996, co-produced and distributed by Sinica Podcast and SupChina. On this show, I and my colleague Zara Zhang interview movers and shakers of China's tech industry, as well as tech leaders who have a US and China cross-border perspective. Why is the show called 996? 996 is a work schedule that many Chinese founders have organically adopted. That is 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. To us, 996 captures the intensity, drive, and speed of Chinese internet companies, many of which are moving faster than our Silicon Valley counterparts. On our 996 podcast, you will hear insights and stories from leading figures like Jerry Yang, founder of Yahoo, Andrew Ng, former chief scientist at Baidu, Kai-Fu Lee, former president of Google China, Liu Zhen of Toutiao in Beijing, and many more. GGV Capital is a $3.8 billion VC firm founded in Silicon Valley 17 years ago. China and the US are home to the world's most vibrant tech ecosystems. It is our hope that the podcast will spark more interest and conversation on what's happening in tech in China and also help foster more cross-border collaboration and understanding between the two markets. I would like to express special thanks to Kaiser Kuo, the host of Sinica Podcast, for helping us to co-produce our show, and also Anna Chung at SupChina for distributing it via her networks. We invite you to take a listen to our show at 996.ggvc.com. Thank you and enjoy the show.
So download the thing. I'm serious. You'll love it. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our long-awaited tech panel. We have a terrific panel that represents a real range and diversity of perspectives on what's happening in tech in China, ranging from the angel stage to venture to private equity, and with the entrepreneur's perspective as well. Let me introduce you to our outstanding panel. First, we have Anna Fang, of course, who is a CEO and partner at Gen Fund, which is an early-stage VC in China. Anna was in charge of M&A and BD for GE China, which was formerly covering consumer and retail for JP Morgan here in New York, so she knows a thing or two about investing. Please check out Gen Fund's portfolio in the bio. It's very impressive. She has understandably made quite a name for herself in the world of VC in China already, and we are delighted that she could join us to share her insights. Sitting next to her, between us, is Fritz Demopoulos, who is very well known to anyone who's followed tech in China any time in the last maybe 17, 18 years. He has had not just one, but two very successful companies that he exited from successfully. The first was a sports portal called Shawei, which he sold to Tom.com at the top of the market right before the dot-com bubble back in 2000. The second was Qunar. A friend of mine once described kayak.com to me as, 美国的Qunar, which is a real arrival. It was, the American Qunar. And that was, of course, acquired by Baidu, actually, on my watch while I was there, and then is now part of Ctrip. These days, among many other things, he's also running Asia's premier science fiction conference, which is going to be in next month, in March, in Hong Kong. It's called the Mellon Conference. They've had just an amazing gamut of a galaxy, as it were, of sci-fi celebrities and stars. And I hope to make it down there one of these days. And as you are soon to see, he is one of the deepest thinkers who I know about technology in China, somebody who always has a real gem of insight up his sleeve and who unfailingly manages to see both the forest and the trees. And I'm lavishing praise on him today because he just told me before we got on that my fly was down. So I owe him one. We have to start this discussion by talking of course, by first introducing Savio Tong, who is a real legend in the industry who recently retired, but is still quite actively involved with InvestCore. He's a senior consultant there. He brings to our discussion very broad perspective, both temporally, we can say that, and across many industry verticals, and we're excited that he could take part in our panel. Thank you, Savio.
Thank you.
A round for our terrific panelists. So we have to start our conversation talking about the narrative around tech in China, not just in the popular media, but also among technology watchers, the more specialized watchers more generally. Just 2 or 3 years ago, I think you would have, if you were to take a survey, look out into the world, 2 or 3 years ago, you still had our then Vice President Joe Biden, I miss him dearly, but our then Vice President Joe Biden going around making speeches at various college graduations, talking about how China is really unable to innovate. Not being free, they're unable to innovate, and we Americans always having freedom will always be innovative. So apparently, it's not just a necessary but also a sufficient condition for innovation, being free. Then we had Carly Fiorina, who really ought to know better. After all, she was the CEO of HP and knows a thing or two about technology and about China. But she was on the campaign trail talking about how, challenging people to show one thing that China has ever innovated. Now, that narrative has changed on a dime. Today, we're constantly reading about how China is going to eat our lunch and to out-innovate us completely. And everyone seems to be sort of making a stampede toward finding out what's happening in the world of technology in China. They're going to beat us in this new AI arms race. So let's start our panel today by asking Anna to give us a good, sober, sensible way to frame our comparative thinking about these two tech ecosystems. How do we do this without hype?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I would agree with you in saying that I personally am very bullish on China and relatively bearish on U.S. When I travel a lot between the two, but that's just what I witness. And I think, the reason since Biden, I'm trying to think what has really changed. And I think part of it is there are so many unicorn companies that are Chinese now. I think almost as many as in the U.S. So I think you see so many unicorns, and also WeChat. I mean, a lot of users of WeChat will know that it's probably the best product out there. I mean, I use Facebook too, and I just, there's so many things I think Facebook could be doing. I just can't stand to use Facebook, to be honest. Anyway, I'm probably being extreme. But the point is, I think that's kind of why. And I think, and you look back and say, when we started 6 years ago, we also thought that a lot of Chinese companies were copying U.S. companies. And I think, I think to our own investing, and I think every time we look at a company, we'd ask them what's their comparable in the U.S. Look at Crunchbase, see what they're doing, how much money was raised, and essentially we're copying what U.S. VCs were doing. So we were a victim as well. And I think that's because it's the easy way. You know that a business model worked in the U.S., so it probably would work in China. And I think fundamentally what entrepreneurs do is they're solving pain points. So if there's a pain point and you're solving pain points are similar across people around the world. And I think what's happened is the acceleration in China has been accelerating over the past few years. And a lot of that has been driven by, I think, WeChat. WeChat Pay has given rise to a whole host of companies like Mobike and Ofo, and other innovations. And I think one could even argue, is there too much innovation? I've taken a look at a lot of not stupid ideas, but like really interesting ideas, like do we need a box to sing karaoke when we wait in line for KTV? There's karaoke boxes that you scan and sing. Or for example, at the Shanghai airport, you might notice those coconut machines where you pay 15 RMB and you get a I love coconut juice, so it's great that I have a fresh coconut, but that's a Series B. Like people put in $50 million into that company to get coconut juice. There's treadmills on the street corners, right? And you can pay, who wants to run in a booth where someone just ran 5 minutes ago and it's all sweaty and disgusting and probably someone hasn't cleaned it. So I think, innovation is, Chinese people have always been innovative, I think. And it's just, there is a lot of capital funding these innovative ideas. And I think, but a lot of that is just the ecosystem and the acceleration, which for me as a venture capitalist makes so interesting to be in China because I'm seeing all these new interesting ideas all the time. And it's even more exciting than what I see in Silicon Valley.
Jump in if you have anything to add, but or we can just move on to the next question that I have for you, which is really about these two ecosystems and this claim that you'll often hear that the two are really diverging right now, that they're moving further and further away from one another. They've parted and they are going to continue to diverge. So Savio, let me ask you this first. How do you see this divergence with respect to the regulatory environments in the two countries? Chinese regulators, when they look across the Pacific to what's happened in the US and around the world, but really especially in the US, from social media powered uprisings in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe to the Snowden revelations to Russian meddling in the US election in 2016, they must be patting themselves on the back and saying, I told you so, and saying, see, we were right to champion this idea of internet sovereignty. But how is this impacting the thinking of investors who are looking at getting into technology in China, this divergent regulatory?
Yeah, let me just go back a little bit in terms of what you said on regulatory issues. I think the most recent cases of Huawei and also MoneyGram, in terms of their unsuccessful attempt to acquire some of the U.S. activities, I think that's a little bit of the blind spot for some of the Chinese companies. Frankly, I think Baba was a bit careless in assuming that they would get approval in MoneyGram. On day one, a lot of institutional investors were very skeptical. And I think in this case, they did not do enough homework to understand the powerful OCC in terms of AML and money laundering control. So, I think he was hoping to be able to convert the White House to support him, but even the White House couldn't support in this case. And similarly in Huawei, I think it will come one day, but maybe now is not the time in this environment. Now, I'm not saying the Chinese companies are not able to come to the US and be a global player. There are many other successful acquisitions, M&A done in the US, and I think that will continue. In my office, once a month, I get a Chinese private equity firm coming in and say, let's do some co-investing together in the US, whether it's business technology company, education, healthcare, industrial. there's a lot of interest in that. So I think it's a question of maturity. It's a question of people being a little bit more thoughtful about what they can do or they cannot do. But let me flip to the point about control and how the two regions, or I could say maybe the Western region and the China region are different. The topic that is always in my mind is about cybersecurity. We hear a lot about this. I'm on the public company here, and the board created a cybersecurity committee just to focus on that. So every major board on the agenda is cybersecurity. But you don't hear much about that in China. Yeah. In some of the Chinese companies, they are way behind in understanding cybersecurity and in terms of what they're going to do about it. Now, I also sit on the board of Bank of China Hong Kong, and I'm the chair of the audit committee. I can assure you we are very focused on cybersecurity.
But you think this is a big blind spot for a lot of Chinese
It is
companies?
a big blind spot for many Chinese companies, and I think including the government, they are not energetic enough to focus on it. Now, I think the government have their own agenda. For many practical reasons, they don't really want to push this. But that's going to come. So as an investor, Kaiser, I'm quite excited about investing in cybersecurity because in Europe, they're catching up now. They also have a lot more data privacy regulations. In China and in Asia, they're way behind.
Right.
So this is where it's an area from a business technology standpoint, I think we will see a lot of activities. And whether the government leadership is still resisting or not, it's going to happen because there will be disasters in terms of data privacy, in terms of hacking, in terms of corrupting the enterprise.
A lot of need for cooperation, right?
I think that's an area that they will explore together. They do have crisis, but frankly, in my mind, they don't talk about it.
Fritz, it's hard for me not to see what happened with Huawei's bid to try to sell handsets through AT&T and that deal getting squashed. We still, to be sure, we don't know whether at what level this happened. Nobody's really been talking openly about that yet. Or at Alibaba's bid to acquire MoneyGram, and not see this as the first stirrings of reciprocity over things like the cybersecurity law, which effectively really hobbles a lot of American tech companies from competing in China.
You know,
is that how you see this?
Well, I mean, I guess I see it slightly different. You know, I mean, academic studies have been done in the United States, by the way, specifically at UCLA and Stanford, that have shown that if a country controls its own information infrastructure, its own banking system, allocation of capital, now government-owned, privately-owned, it's probably mostly privately-owned, but if local people control those institutions, those governments tend to be more accountable, tend to be more open, and so in some ways, when you talk about like internet sovereignty, or you could say tech sovereignty, like broadly speaking, you know, there's an argument to be made that, you know, maybe it's a good idea that we don't have these massive global leviathans, and maybe, you know, companies like Germany are the fools for not having their own search engine, for example, and maybe their own, you know, sure, they have their own local banking system, which is good, but, you know, I think what we see around the world is, you know, some of these larger U.S. players and more some of these Chinese players, which are becoming dominant, and, you know, maybe, you know, if we take a step back and, you know, maybe China would be a better place, and maybe it is a better place because it does control its own information infrastructure. I mean, I don't know if it's a good idea if the government controls it and the 1% share and all that sort of stuff. But I do think that if local communities have a better sense or like more at stake with their local institutions, and then the governments tend to be better. And, you know, there's a problem in the States, right? I mean, Google is so dominant, it's decimated the local media industries, right? And so, for example, in like the state where I'm from, in Sacramento, you might have only 1 or 2 journalists covering, the state government, which controls a budget that's probably as big as China's budget, right? And because everything's in Washington, D.C., everything's so concentrated, everything's so sensationalized, or the Kardashianization / Trumpism of media and coverage and all that sort of stuff. and I'm kind of wondering, maybe one way to think about it is, maybe there's this war going back and forth and all that sort of stuff, right? Or, but maybe another way to think about it is, maybe it's a good idea that this is a bit more fragmented. And like, I know Eric Schmidt's not going to like it, and I'm sure if you did a Google search, those academic studies aren't going to come up, but they're there. Maybe that's a good thing, and it's a good thing for all countries. And so, that might be like another way to think about it. And so I do have a little bit of sympathy for some of these barriers. And, you could still parachute into China like I did and somehow, kind of still do stuff, but,
Let's talk about divergence or convergence from the perspective of consumer behaviors, of consumer habits, of how the Chinese people use. I mean, you'll hear this morning we heard somebody say the Chinese consumer of today is the American consumer of 5 years from now. But other people are arguing that there is pretty marked divergence. Anna, how do you see it? I mean, as somebody who looks at a lot of consumer plays.
Mostly, what I see is most of it happening on mobile. Like the post-90s generation, we're really investing in consumers of the post-90s generation. So what they want is convenience. They want fashionable items. They want easy access, fast logistics. And they're using, there are a lot of new brands. I think this is going to be a trend, especially this year, is a lot of new Chinese local brands that are built to Chinese tastes, as well as Chinese foods that are built to Chinese, and local Chinese brands that people aspire to, who know how to market to Chinese young people. If you look at the post-90s generation, like, they're not really buying houses or cars. Right. So there's a lot more disposable income, and they're spending on, like, furniture, and for their rental furniture like 早做, or their food, and like takeout is
Is that so different from millennials here, though? They're not buying dinner napkins and spending all their money on avocado toast, right? So
there's not maybe it's not that different, but I think it's surprising to find Chinese young people to be like Americans.
Right.
I think that in itself is surprising. I think the post-90s generation is very different from me. Post-80s.
And to be honest, Kaiser, even if there are some differences, it's like Chinese people, they get up in the morning, they have breakfast,
put their pants on one leg at a time.
They want to take their kids to school. Just all the basic stuff, right? And what we find out is, so consumers make functional decisions, they make experiential decisions, and symbolic, right? Symbolic would be like wearing a Chanel bag or something. Like experiential might be playing some sort of virtual game, and of course functional stuff is everything else, right? Where it's a little bit more price and quality driven. And what we see in this world is most economies, most decisions are functional driven. And then you have this little subsection that's a bit more quirky and different. Right. That might be more entertainment, where you could say, okay, Chinese people have a virtual identity that's maybe more important to them than it is in other markets, and like all that sort of stuff. But
70% convergence, 30% divergence.
Yeah, something like that would be a way to think about it.
I think you cannot open any kind of tech publication about China without reading all about AI. It's AI everything. There's this AI gold rush that's going on right now, this real land grab. It's been really revolutionary. I was fortunate enough to have a front seat to it, working for many years at Baidu, which invested very, very heavily in AI. But one thing that I came to realize was that the necessary resources to do a lot of AI-related work really are all held within the hands of these gigantic tech companies, FANG in the United States, Facebook and Amazon and Apple and also Google and Microsoft, but also in China under BAT, where you have the gigantic GPU clusters, these massive neural nets, very expensive pieces of hardware. You have oceanic amounts of data, and you have this AI talent that you have to pay $1 million+ salaries a year to. That's only going to be at these big companies. So how is it possible to play in AI, to invest in AI, besides just buying shares in BAT in China?
I think we need Kai Fu Lee here for this topic.
I mean, I think the U.S., it is like a lot of our investments, it's hard to do things because Google is sort of everywhere. But in China, Baidu's definitely ahead of the game, but we have like, I don't know, probably around 30 AI-related companies that Baidu Ventures is, we work very closely with. But I think China is, in terms of startups getting ahead, at least what I witness is they are getting more ahead. And I think, there are several, we have a few billion-dollar companies that are AI companies in China. And I think the difference is the information that we've been talking about. Because governments own the information, not people. In America, the AI companies say they have a hard time getting all the data because there are a lot of personal privacy laws.
Pesky privacy laws.
Yeah, but in China, you don't really have
You can just
that,
ride
right?
roughshod over those in China, right?
So a lot of the governments or banks,
Unless you're in Langley, Virginia, I guess it's different.
like medical imaging that's using AI, like hospitals can make that decision. You don't have to get all the patient consent. Or security cameras, like we have a lot of governments using, like some of our AI companies doing security. And, these private companies are analyzing the cars on the road or faces. Like there's a lot of facial recognition companies. So I see a lot of startups actually, working out in the AI space in China, at least.
So you can play in AI, or you can play in companies that sell out to the government, to Big Brother, right?
Yeah, that's what's happening.
Yeah.
But I think related to that, though, my concern is too much of the AI ecosystem would depend on the BATs because they control the data. They are the ones that are way ahead. So if I have a startup, I almost have to embrace one of those kind of local monopolies,
Right.
which is a concern because I think that won't work in the U.S. And so you're going to have a little bit of divergency here. I think the U.S. AI research is heading the other way. So I think it's a good segment to invest in. I think China AI is definitely something that people are thinking about and trying to participate in that investment situation, opportunity.
People compare BAT and FANG all the time, right? Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Do you think that to an extent, BAT actually dominates its respective tech ecosystem to a greater extent than even FANG does in the US or in the rest of the world?
Well, now it's all about TMD.
Right.
You guys heard of TMD?
Technology, media, and...
No, it's Toutiao.
Oh, Toutiao. Oh, right. The second generation. Right. ByteDance, Meituan, and DNP.
Didi.
Oh, Didi.
Didi is one, of course. So,
So the second generation.
About TMD.
TMD, by the way, that's a cute little pun if you know Chinese. Right. what TMD means? It's not suitable for
the younger
webcast,
kids. Right.
But you could ask the laughing Chinese person next to you to explain it. Right.
The interesting thing is, for years, I remember years ago people said, so what's your GYM strategy? GYM. It was Google, Yahoo, Microsoft. No one ever. So there's always an acronym and another one, and yeah, you're right. Didi and Xiaomi. These are some amazing companies that aren't even part of the BATs, right? And some people say it's an at really these days, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's possible, especially with their control on data. Hence maybe they'll have a lock on some of these AI opportunities, possibly. And what we have seen is an unprecedented amount of corporate entrepreneurship, coming out of Tencent and Ali, that could be even make them even more dominant in China than maybe other markets. But I think as an entrepreneur, I don't think about that too much. I think there seems to be always giant killer opportunities in China, and I'm super excited about it. And at the end of the day, it's not going to be in the existing spaces; it's going to be in new areas. And shockingly, many years ago, anyone could have done that silly search business, but then somehow Google did it, right? And so we continue to see it where new companies, they scale very quickly. Should Toutiao exist? I mean, it was really a massive strategic error on some of the large players that,
Sure.
like Toutiao existed in the first place. And,
Why didn't Baidu
yeah.
do that after all?
Yeah, right. Exactly right. And so, I mean, yeah, maybe there's some dominance there, but that certainly hasn't stopped people from punting.
Sure.
I mean, that's for sure.
Fritz, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the BAT have become essentially conglomerates now, right? In conventional wisdom in the West, we don't like conglomerates. We think that they allocate capital really inefficiently. We think that they're ossified, they're clunky, they're slow. But we were chatting earlier, and you were making the case, again, Fritz the contrarian here, that actually in a particular circumstances, a conglomerate is a better way to go.
Yeah.
Does China, first of all, what are those conditions? Does China fit that?
Yeah, so what we've seen, and again, I don't want to sound like an academic, but like the academic research has shown that in...
That's twice, one,
Yeah,
no more.
Sorry,
no more
sorry. Or else I'm going to sound like, Kaiser right now. So what is that in highly dynamic environments where the economies are changing quickly or rapid growth, we tend to see that conglomerates are a much more efficient way to allocate capital and nurture businesses. And part of that is because management expertise, access to distribution, access to other resources, maybe data, kind of as we talked about.
Absolutely.
And so maybe China is in that phase now. For example, if the economy maybe slows down, and it is, and maybe innovation slows a little bit for like a host of different reasons, it could be that maybe that becomes a less efficient way to kind of deploy capital. Right. And one of the reasons why conglomerates were all the rage in the UK and the States and Europe and places like that in the 60s and the 70s when there was a lot of growth, changes in the economy, and all of a sudden there was a lot of pressure to stick to your knit. I think they called it like stick to your knitting and
right.
Be very focused. And it could, now, having said that, and everything I just said, we have heard of this VC conglomerate model where, in fact, GenFund is one of those companies actually where there's so many companies that you've invested in, and like Kleiner Perkins in the States or Sequoia or whatever, that maybe these conglomerate style approaches that some of the funds are taking, i.e. having a very, very wide net and having on staff, HR experts and all that could possibly maybe like approximate the value add, like other conglomerate.
Of a conglomerate.
And
but still be the size of a...
Yeah, so to be honest, in a nutshell, I think right now, I think it's still uncertain. I'm looking back 10. If we try to project in the future, will we say Tencent was an efficient way to deploy capital and therefore better just be a Tencent shareholder, or it was just like a waste of money and they should have been an LP in the GenFund and some other funds? I don't know.
And I want to ask you about this. Those of us who've been watching the tech scene in China and are now watching these piles of group share of these bikes, these bike share bikes, piled, stacked high like mountains, and having to use these gigantic machines to move them around. It's become sort of a standard joke. I mean, it's a big old white elephant now, but. This is the result of a lot of VCs rushing into this space, right? And this is not the first time we've seen this happen before. Not too long ago, everybody had to be in an O2O play, an on-demand play, sort of delivering this or delivering that. And then not many years before that, everyone had a Groupon clone, a Deal of the Day site, a sort of a group buy site. And I think you can go back. I mean, video sharing sites. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of them for a while. They all sort of seem to shake out into a few major players. People used to ask me about this, and I'd say, "Yeah, sure. It's a blood-red bay out of which one gigantic shark is going to swim out into a blue ocean opportunity." But that was, of course, I was doing apologetics, PR for a company that was so investing. But What about now? I mean, what is? I guess I'm curious as to what's leading to this behavior, the why behind it. What are some of the? Let's explore, maybe interrogate this question of how this happens again and again.
This is almost like 2001.
Yeah.
Well, look, the reality is there is a certain formula that I think people, I'll give credit to Hans for saying that he calls it a formula, and I think it's true. It's at the angel or Series A stage, you don't know which player is going to come, and one model works, okay? And then everybody wants, like right now, it's HQ Trivia in America is really popular. One of our companies in our Fund 1 actually pivoted doing it, and they, within 3 days, had the same number of users as HQ Trivia did over a few days, and now they have 3 million days. It's, going really well. And all of a sudden, in China, they're like, 100 companies already, and there'll be like 1,000 probably by next month. So there is this herd mentality. And then what happens is, a few of them will get funded. But then the best 2 or 3 will get a lot of money. So like a Sequoia, GGV will get, $10, $20 million. And then the rest of them, there's just no way they're gonna make it. Like take biking, we're in OFO, so the yellow bike. So basically, once the 2 of them got so much money, I mean, they at one point, when the blue bike was fundraising,
We're not going to say its name.
the 2, OFO and Mobike had 95% of the capital. There's just no way that third one is really going to come up. So the formula is, I think the perceived formula is you put so much money in that, and it is, capital becomes a barrier to entry. You look at the mobile charging dockets, like the charging your phone dockets that was so popular in China. We had passed on a few of them, and then 3 of them became really hot, and there was so much money in. We thought, it still doesn't make sense for us to put if we didn't put in money. But basically, once there's so much money in, and then everyone, there's no way. I mean, for another one to, it just doesn't work out, and.
Right. So you just.
So the formula
bet until
you're gonna, there are a few that are gonna pop out, and the rest are gonna. But at that, there's one point in time when it's not clear, and you still have a shot, and it seems to make sense, and people are always looking for new business ideas, and there is a copy mentality still, So I think people copy the interface, but people don't realize like beyond the interface, there's so much that happens. Not just business model, but team and operations and strategy and speed and timing. That really makes a company.
So we were chatting about this a little bit before, and we were talking about is there a role that excess capital is playing in this? I mean, a couple of possibilities here. First, maybe to Savio, the availability of cheap capital. I mean, ever since the financial crisis, debt has been very, very inexpensive.
Yeah, I mean, with interest rate so low for so long, I think you definitely have a lot of people willing to compromise the risk and take a higher beta approach in investing, and I think
moral hazard sort of.
Yeah, it is. But I'm listening to Anna said. I think this is all part of the process. I think from a Western institutional standpoint, I dealt with many. Here, they have been quite cautious in the last few years about this. And they recognize that they miss some of these unicorns, but they actually feel better. And now when the AI topic is coming up, I see a lot more excitement from them to say that this is real tech investing. Right. So I'm not going to be depending on just one trend, but I'm actually seeing a long-term business in terms of AI helping many industries, helping many companies, helping us as human beings. So I think that money will continue to come. But I certainly think that the money dry up. Now, on the other hand, what we don't see from here is that you have a lot of domestic, mainland Chinese believing in it because they live in it. So they actually were a lot more aggressive in putting money and funding startups and VCs. And many of them will lose money. But I think many of them have made good money. This is investing. You just have to have the right judgment and pick the right managers. So I think interest rate is a factor globally, affecting many investment managers.
Fritz, another source of, let's say, cheap money in VC or the availability of a lot of surrogate capital comes from the reallocation by very, very large funds of some money to VC. For example, you were telling me about CalPERS, right? The California pension fund, basically, the public employees retirement account, which is, I don't know how big it is, but it's probably $1 trillion or something, right?
No, less than that.
Less than that, maybe. But they shifted, a small percent, even like a percent of that shifting into VC is an awful lot of liquidity, right? Is that what may have happened in China?
I think that's part of it, where large institutions are allocating more to China. It used to be, you got to allocate 2% to China, right. And then now they say let's allocate 4%, and all of a sudden, that's another $100 billion, right? Of which, part of that will go to early stage venture, growth, whatever. I guess they call it alternative. I guess since we're in New York, we have to use the word, right? It's called alternative, and so yeah, I think that's part of it. And then I think also, so there's this excess capital, but like one of our good friends, Victor Koo, right, talks about maybe China is not as risky as people think it is.
How's that?
Maybe we think that maybe there's a lot of concern about the government being predatory, but maybe we shouldn't be. And maybe the laws work a little bit better than people think, and so therefore, if you think operating in China is a little bit lower risky than other people, you're willing to bet more, mm-hmm. And so and maybe the market's doing that, and that's driving valuation up a little bit. That's allowing investors, to maybe invest in 2 or 3 companies in the space as opposed to one, which is interesting, because one of the problems is, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, all these bike guys are out there. There's a lot of money flowing. It's like, this looks and sounds insane, until you start thinking, well, if you think China's not as risky, from a macro perspective, and then in anything that's less risky, there's an inverse relationship, which means you think the returns are going to be better, and that might be something that's happening. Mm. And then also, I would like to add is, there's this assumption out there that it's like winner take all. Like every category is winner take all. It's going to be Alibaba or nobody. It's going to be WeChat or nobody. But maybe in some of the O2O categories, maybe it's not going to be winner take all. Maybe 3 or 4 companies could actually do very well. Of course, the biggest one will probably have the biggest margins, but maybe you'll have maybe some of the smaller and mid-sized players also do okay. And if you actually think it's actually not going to be winner take all, that might behoove an investor or more an entrepreneur to jump into a category in spite of the blue bike and the yellow bike and the orange bike and the pink bike and the brown and the maroon bike and whatever, that's there already. And so maybe that's also happening too a little bit, where, it's kind of interesting because we just assume that everything is winner take all, but maybe it isn't.
Winner take all assumes a more or less homogeneous market too, and we're seeing a market that's really beginning to differentiate. So in an O2O play, there's a high-end food delivery. There's room for other types of food delivery, for example. Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to what Savio was saying earlier, because I thought it was really intriguing about the institutional investors that you've been talking to and how they see investment in AI as a real solid investment for something that is a profound transformative thing. It is as something that has not just the potential, it's inevitably going to disrupt a number of industry verticals. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that another way that we're looking at getting into investing in AI, by looking at where the hammer is going to fall, and it's looking for the fallout from this AI transformation that's going to be happening? And is that how you guys are thinking about this?
Well,
Anna, why don't you?
Anna, sorry.
I mean,
like healthcare, for example, is one obvious area.
I think healthcare is just a real good investment thesis there using AI. Makes a lot of sense. Like we have a few companies that are just helping to look at cancer imaging better
Right.
through AI.
Anything that does pattern recognition, a deep learning system is simply
Yeah.
going to do better than humans, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you, like for us, AI, we probably have the most number of AI investments in China, and there was never one day that we sat down and said we're going to invest in AI because our investment, we're so early. It's all about the team. So what happened is a few years ago we invested in a bunch of really smart people, a lot of them from Google, a lot of overseas returnees. And they happen to be doing like big data, machine learning, blah, blah, blah. And then later on, it was like AI, and all of them became like sort of AI companies, and a lot of them really successful. And, you know, we were never saying we wanted to invest in AI. And that's kind of the story. I mean, for angel investing, it's like if there's a theme and I'm not, if there was like a bike theme and I'm not in it, it's already too late for us.
Right.
So I don't know if I can really answer your question.
Fritz, do you have anything to add?
By the way, I don't mean to bring up, and I think the audience may be disappointed that we don't talk about Bitcoin, but I'm not an expert on it, and I'm negative on it, so I'm not going to talk about. But I think on your AI discussion, it's broader than just AI for healthcare, AI for robotics. But if you look at, we talked before, Shenzhen, which is not the hot name like Beijing or Shanghai, but Shenzhen, 70% of the world's mobile phones are designed and made in Shenzhen. So, and then I know there's a big consortium or kind of movement involving Singapore, Hong Kong, the financial authorities, and the banking sector, and Shenzhen, because as Anna said, everything is mobile.
That's right.
So this is another trend that I think investors are excited with. You know, with fintech, with the mobile payment, and also with the combination of AI, pattern recognition, it's huge. And you can picture, and it's happening to tomorrow, that the banks will be digitalized. And this is not just accounting, general ledger, this is not just payment. I'm talking about risk management. I'm talking about their customer servicing. So to me, these are more business technology, but these are trends that people are very excited with.
So yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are looking at China and looking at fintech and even looking at cryptocurrencies and things like that and are very excited, and there's an awful lot happening there. There are also a lot of people who are on two sides of whether regulation in China is friend or foe for fintech innovation. There are some people who say it's the Wild West there, that you can ask forgiveness later rather than asking permission first in China. And a lot of companies have actually gone and done that. Ant Financial has been quite cavalier about rolling out things that the CSRC or the CBRC is not quite comfortable with yet, and then later on filling in the regulatory walls.
I think some of that is political. I think some of that is I think the regulators, CBRC or PBOC, are trying to also understand and follow what's going on. I know that many of the regulators are bothered by this.
Yes.
So they are coming up with their own digital currency initiative to as a way to neutralize some of that. But the behavior of regulators is not great, because every regulator is very selfish. He's looking within the country. He's not able to look at pan-region or pan-Asian. So they are now finally getting together. It took forever for us to introduce FATCA and to get multinational commitment to this. Same thing with currency. I think that is also a regulatory trend that is going to happen.
I mean, because I think there were a lot of people pretty scared about what happened in just recent months with the closure of the ending of all the initial coin offers, and then the closing of a lot of the exchanges, the Bitcoin exchanges, and so forth. It spooks people. So regulatory regulation gives.
Take your profit on your Bitcoin. Right. Take the profit.
It's a little late now. It's It's a little bit late now. You mentioned Shenzhen as someplace that often gets ignored. And this is a favorite theme of mine and something that I remember we were at in Cambridge and we went out for a drink and we were talking about this, about how in Shenzhen, you really are sitting atop the global supply chain for so many of the world's advanced consumer electronics, and the advantages that confers on a startup founder and an entrepreneur, the way that you can iterate so quickly, you can prototype so quickly, you can ride that yellow bike or the blue bike down the street to your to your OEM or to your ODM and get product out really quickly. Talk about this, and what about some of the other ways in which Shenzhen is sort of a miracle factory these days?
Yeah, what I think is interesting is, like you can't underestimate, the value of proximity.
Mm-hmm.
You're just, and all the players within that ecosystem, whether they're investors or designers or engineers, and somehow this stuff just bubbles up, and there's just so much less friction than if you're across a country or just globally, internationally. Right. Like we hear a lot of companies say, yeah, I got my thing in Shenzhen, but they're based in California. And to me, there's just so much friction doing that versus, the local guy that's just down the street. To be honest, being based in Hong Kong, there's friction between Hong Kong
and Shenzhen, yeah.
Absolutely. Of course, ignoring all the umbrellas and all that sort of stuff in the process, and like you just can't underestimate, that fantastic value that can be created, just by just being there, and as like our experience in Beijing has shown, right? Like you almost can't help but just start picking up stuff, and at every single coffee shop or like tech community center,
it's in the air.
Whatever it is, yeah, and that I think, is I'm personally super optimistic about Shenzhen, and what's nice too is some of the smartest guys in Beijing are telling their employers, you're going to have to move me to a better environment. And they're just shipping them down to Shenzhen, to be honest. And so that's great, too.
Anna, is Beijing now a complete tech ecosystem? Are all the pieces now in place? Is there anything still missing? So I think that we've got money, we've got plenty of educated workforce.
Complete. I think it's complete.
Yeah. What about things like law firms who know how to structure deals, and accounting firms that know how to... all the peripheral stuff, it's all there now.
It's good. But I think
you can't say that about many places in the world.
Are Beijing, and then Shanghai is our second largest. We just hired our first person in Shenzhen who came from Tencent. And if you look at CES last week, I think 30% of companies were from like Shenzhen, Guangdong area. So, however, I'm a little skeptical because our own portfolio, the Shenzhen ones have been the slowest to grow.
Interesting.
And some of the software companies are moving out of Shenzhen because they have a hard time hiring people. Like we have one AI company there, harder to find talent than if they were based in Shanghai or Beijing. They're probably moving to Beijing. So, and when I mentioned, I find that my companies there are just a little more sleepy than the ones in other cities in terms of, it is a nicer place. It's warmer and better, right? So people in Beijing, like there's nothing else to do because it's so cold, and the weather sucks outside. So, the 996 is definitely applicable in Beijing and Shanghai.
In the time what remains, I want to shift the discussion over to a discussion of blind spots. We talked a little bit about some blind spots earlier, but I want to do it in a few parts here. I want to first talk about blind spots that U.S.-based investors have when looking at China today. And maybe we can all go around and talk about what you would identify some. And then I want to shift it and talk about, since we are seeing, or we've seen so much in recent years, outbound investment in the tech sector specifically from China. What are the blind spots when they look at the rest of the world? And then finally, I do want to talk about the difficulties that Chinese companies are having in expanding to markets abroad, specifically here into North America, the difficulties that they've had. So let's start with the U.S. investor community and their blind spots vis-a-vis China. Whoever wants to start can.
I feel like there's just too few Americans who know about China, right? That's what you guys are doing is really interesting. Like if you look at all the Chinese people who come abroad to the U.S. every year, it's like, 500,000 people who are coming to study. Like the number of people who are going to China, study in China is less than 100,000. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely less than 100,000. So there's not that much knowledge about what's going on in China. I mean, I'm talking to investors this week, and like a lot of people are interested in China, and they're asking because they've never been to China, or maybe they went once, you know. And a lot of people in Silicon Valley, they're very, like, they're interested in China, but they don't even, I mean, they don't go, they don't know, you know. And so there's a lot of, you know, I don't know if it's blind spot, but there is starting to be more and more curiosity and acceptance, a lot more than years ago. But the fundamental, I mean, it has to start at the more grassroots early education level. And now certainly Chinese is more popular in America, but I would hope to see just more people trying to study there, learn the language, and work there.
That's a big blind spot. It's not what I had
I'm
in
not saying,
mind.
I mean, I'm being very harsh, but I mean, you know, I mean, certainly probably every venture capitalist in China, I mean, most of them are making a visit to the US every year,
Yeah.
at least once, right? To learn about what's going on, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, that asynchronous information flow is, as a U.S. investor should be very worried, to be honest, right? If you think about it. And also, I mean, every Chinese entrepreneur knows everything that's happening in the States.
This is true.
Kind of within their category. And of course, they know what's happening within their own category in China. But the reverse is definitely not true. And, you know, now the good thing about investors, you know, like specifically is, you know, quite a number of investors are smart enough to realize, well, I'm going to have local managers. So either they're just LPs, or they, which is very common, obviously, and then, of course, they have their consulting firms to figure out who are all the great local managers and all that sort of stuff. Or sometimes they do the franchise model, right, which is how, you know, like I guess that's how Sequoia started, and SoftBank's known for doing that. Some, yeah, you know, try to go in and, you know, do deals, and that's the hubris approach, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And like every now and then someone gets a bit lucky, or you know what they do? It's kind of the follow approach. It's they go, you know, Anna, just tell me what deals I should invest in. And
Right.
you're like,
Just piggybacking on.
well, you mean, are you going to give me part of the carry? How is that going to work, right?
Right.
Do you want me to do all the work, right? Right. And so like we see that too a little bit, but that's not very sustainable, that approach. So is it blind spot? The good thing is, more and more people realize their limitations. They don't understand. I think a blind spot would be how extreme. I don't think they understand how extreme it is.
Right.
But
You mean extreme in terms of the competitive pressures and just
yeah,
the intensity
and
of
yeah, you know, the intensity of their local Chinese competitors that just are scouring. So whether it's investors or entrepreneurs, like they don't see that. You're right. Every single Chinese in the VCs in the States at least once a year.
Yeah.
And they're building relationships, or trying to understand things, whatever it is, right? And entrepreneurs the same way, right? And it's my sense that they just don't see how extreme it is.
It's a knife fight. It's a nasty, right. Savio?
Yeah, my statement is less applicable to venture capital, but I think
We're asking you for
U.S.
the PE,
investors
yeah.
going into China, they often make the mistake of only connecting with one or two, just like what Fritz said. For them to go in once or twice a year, to think that they know, is just too naive. I mean, I go 4 times a year for 10 years now. I still don't know some of the changes. It's not like Anna, who's in Beijing, you know, she can read the body language. She can understand the changes way better than I can. So some of the American investors, I think, fail in this part. And then the other thing is that, you know, once they get comfortable with 1 or 2 managers, that's it. They just go home and just bang on those 2. That's not good enough either, because there are a lot of changes. There are a lot of generational issues. You cannot just use your quantitative technology to monitor these managers, which is also quite common with pension funds and consultants. They just put you through this modeling, thinking that they can now make the conclusion that this is an alpha manager. So they make those mistakes. A little bit of institutional bad habits, I would say. So I think there's no shortcut to this.
Right.
I think you just have to go local, go intense, and invest time and money to have a good base to be
No shortcuts, no
one of the
substitutes.
gangs. Yes.
So let's stay with you, Savio, and talk about, since you work so much with Chinese investors who are looking for investment opportunities abroad in North America, and then especially as InvestCorp is in Europe, right?
A couple of mistakes that I've seen many of the Chinese groups coming in thinking that it's easy. Just like we think it's easy to invest in China. Some of the Chinese investors think coming here is easy and it's a safe haven. I can park money in the US, just buy me a industrial company, maybe I even get the EB5 benefit. That's just too simple. I think they fail to realize that there's a lot of money here also, chasing good opportunities. So if you don't operate like us or other like private equity institutional investors, you're going to be way behind. You cannot come here and say, can I sign an MOU and then I'll come back to you 3 months from now. That's not going to work. The good opportunities are gone. So, but they're learning. I mean, I think to the point that we asked before, they now have an infrastructure. They now know to go to the good law firms. They now know to mobilize the consultants and the accountants early in the game. So they are becoming much more successful. So that's coming. But I think the blind spot still, by and large, is that they think coming here to invest in the US is easy because they can bring the China piece of it.
So to sum up, nothing is easy. It's all hard work, and learn a whole ton of about China, and you can do that at subchina.com. So I want to thank everyone for this terrific panel. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fritz. Thank you, Savio.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening, and
Thank
stay
you.
tuned for more great programming from us.
This panel is moderated by our friend James, partner of Innovating Global Health. Thank you, everyone.